Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for today's special live broadcast. My name is Lane Convolcani, the Director of Alumni Learning with Emory Alumni Association based in Atlanta, Georgia. So pleased to have you here this afternoon. This is part of our digital learning opportunity through the Emory Alumni Association and Emory University. We're offering our content to reflect the values of Emory University and engaging in a breadth of interest within our global alumni community. This month is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and we are proud to celebrate our cultural influences within our Emory community. Today, more than ever, we feel the strength and unity of a diverse body as we navigate this global pandemic. Recently, members of our Asian American and Pacific Islander community, including several of our own alumni, have experienced attacks based on misinformation surrounding the coronavirus. This month, and always, we're supporting all of our communities and encouraging diversity. We're proud to introduce this webinar series to celebrate the culture, address these attacks, and offer suggestions on how to cope and heal. This is the first in a series, and we're going to be following up with ongoing conversations that we're going to have throughout the month and throughout the year. With that, I'm very proud to be joined by expert panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wanda Collins, who's going to introduce herself, and all presenters are going to introduce themselves as they share their expertise in this area. Thank you so much, Dr. Collins.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm Wanda Collins. I'm a psychologist and also an assistant vice president in campus life and the director of our counseling and psychological services. And I'm also Asian American. So what I would say about the COVID pandemic, it's definitely created a lot of fear and uncertainty, really for everyone, but the people who've been most negatively impacted have been people of color and poor people in our community. And for Asians and Asian Americans, there's definitely been an increase of racism and xenophobia, and that's happening in terms of acts of verbal and physical violence, both in the US and also happening really all around the world. So it's definitely an area of concern. And even if we're not the one who's being specifically targeted, when we look at people who we identify with and see that they're being victimized, it can activate a lot of feelings of helplessness, of anger, and just make us feel generally less safe in the world. And when you think about, like, for example, people who might be targets of like domestic violence, they may feel fear in response to that specific person. But when you're talking about racial violence, that fear and not knowing who an attacker might be sort of generalizes so that you are generally walking around feeling unsafe in the world. And in situations where there's verbal violence or physical violence, bystanders and allies play a really critical role in buffering against the long-term psychological impact of that violence. So it could just be a simple statement of dissent, just someone saying, I don't agree with you, or checking in on the person who's being victimized. But the most important thing is to not be silent, because one of the things that you're trying to do in supporting that person is ensuring their physical safety and also helping to ground them in a sense of reality. If you are being impacted by incidents of racism and xenophobia, you know, when we talk about coping and healing, one of the things that's really important is just to acknowledge what's happened to you. Sometimes just naming a traumatic event or a distressing event can be the start of the healing process, because again, it sort of grounds you in the reality of what's happening. And once you're able to name it, then you can start to deal with it directly. The other thing to keep in mind is that any type of act of racial violence is wrong. And it's often the case that when people are victimized, and it's easier to think about this in terms of incidents of child abuse or domestic violence, where the person who's being victimized feels that it must be something that they did or somehow it's their fault. And so if you're supporting someone who has been victimized, or if you're the one who's been victimized, it's really an important thing to keep reminding yourself, because even if your head sort of knows that, sometimes it can take a little bit longer for your heart to sort of come around to understand that. And then just to allow yourself permission to react the way that you react, right? So when we're confronted with situations that are scary, some of us are sort of, right there ready to fight. Some of us freeze up, and some of us will run away. As we're processing emotions, we go through them differently based on past experience, how things impact us, the specifics of the circumstance. So really to practice offering yourself some grace for how you responded in the particular situation and the way that you need to work through your own process for healing. And then the last thing I'll say is that it's really important to share your thoughts and feelings with people who get it and get you. So not people where you're having to explain why something was wrong, but just people who understand inherently that it was and why that would be so upsetting. And that can certainly be family members or friends, sometimes not, or talking with a faith leader or talking with a therapist if that's what's what will be helpful for you. But the main thing is that if you're needing help, if you're finding that it's impacting your ability to focus, impacting your just ability to sort of go through day-to-day life, impacting your safety, that you not be afraid to ask for help and support if you need it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great.
Dr. McGonigal?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Greg McGonigal. I'm the University Chaplain and the Dean for Spiritual and Religious Life at Emory. Just finishing my first year at Emory, so fairly new to the university community, but really glad to be with everyone today. I wanted to start by wishing a happy Ramadan Mubarak to anyone who is celebrating today. This is a holy month for our Muslim community, and also a happy Buddha Day to those in the Buddhist community who are celebrating. We have a large celebration of Buddha Day that will be happening virtually later on today that certainly everyone would be welcome to. You can find it probably through our website, but this is a day where the birth, enlightenment, and passing away of the Buddha are honored in many countries around the world. And just thinking about those traditions and honestly the rootedness of most of our spiritual traditions in Asia, the major traditions of the world are all rooted in Asia, and beginning by sort of centering ourselves in the ancient wisdom that is there. In my role as University Chaplain and Dean for Spiritual and Religious Life, we support the spiritual and philosophical lives of students, faculty, and staff at Emory. And we also, we see that as very intersectional with the work of social justice. And so students and I think faculty and staff know that they can turn to the chaplaincy as a place to, to receive sort of individual care and counseling, but also really to take action and to express what they're feeling about what's going on in the world and come together with others to try to make change. And the COVID-19 pandemic sort of first came to our attention actually, I think in late January, when a group of graduate students who are of Asian descent or actual Asian international students came to us and said, something is going on overseas and it's impacting family members and friends of ours, and it's really concerning, and we want to do a vigil, which is something that we often do in our office in response to either a national event or campus or a global event that happens. And as we got to planning, they actually said, we want to do a vigil, but we don't feel that we can be together in person to do this. Because whatever this disease is, it seems so communicable that that even gathering together, poses a risk to us, and we also don't want to sort of set an example about that. And so we ended up incorporating some prayers and meditations and actions related to the pandemic into some of our existing gatherings and worship services at the time. But it also just planted a seed that this was going to be a very different type of global event, of epidemic and pandemic to respond to. And so, over the months since, we've obviously stayed in close contact with a lot of those students, and now certainly many, many more of our students and the whole university community, which has been impacted by this global pandemic, and also by, unfortunately, the rhetoric that is also part of how political leaders have spoken about this pandemic as somehow connected to places on the globe and races and ethnicities, which we know from a biomedical point of view has really no grounding, but nevertheless it has stirred up and perpetuated for many people histories of oppression and histories of exclusion that go far back. My own, I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister myself, but my own studies were really in South Asian religions and also in Asian religions in the United States. And many people know, but some don't, that there's a long history of Asian exclusion from the United States, and histories of prejudice and marginalization that can be stirred up by the kinds of rhetoric that we've been hearing. And so what we try to do through our spiritual communities is really, Dr. Collins mentioned allyship, and we really try to center that idea of allyship, both supporting communities who feel and who are directly impacted by prejudice and xenophobia, but also trying to educate those who are not from those communities, but who need to learn the histories and need to learn how to be better allies. And there's a lot of literature online about allyship. It's something that we sort of seek to interweave into our communities, our leadership programs. We don't think that someone can be really a responsible spiritual leader today without having a sense of the diverse histories that communities of different faiths and different races have in this country and globally, and also have some tools for how to respond and how to be leaders. And that's what we're seeking to do in all of our faith communities on campus, is really cultivate leadership. Over the past several months, we've been seeking to lift up opportunities for people to learn about the histories of racism and xenophobia and exclusion that are related to the virus and to the pandemic now, and also create opportunities for people to continue to connect virtually and be able to talk about both how this is impacting them personally, but also how they can take action. And we've been glad to see actually many students and faculty and staff continuing to connect online. And the last thing I think that I would say is that in some ways, just as we weren't able to do sort of an in-person vigil around COVID-19 because that didn't make sense, we've learned that about social distancing and many of the ways that we need to stay healthy these days. I would say students are leading the way in the kind of online activism that has been growing in recent years. And so even though we might not march or gather in a typical way that we might have in the past, there's still many opportunities to get connected with organizations that are working on these issues, to take action, to learn that students are taking remotely and that we're seeking to help people to know about. And unfortunately, I think it's also true that that some would use a moment like this to actually perpetuate or stir up racism and violence against different communities and really take advantage of this moment. And so we've been teaching that it's for that reason it's especially important to actually ramp up the kind of activism that we're doing and become fluent in these new ways of taking action. So both centering ourselves and finding care, but also educating ourselves and seeking to find ways to take action to hopefully bring some transformation around these longstanding issues. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Dr. Meltzer?
Yes, I'm Carolyn Meltzer. I'm Executive Associate Dean for Faculty Academic Advancement, Leadership and Inclusion at Emory School of Medicine. I also serve as the chair of the Department of Radiology. And as a healthcare worker, a physician, a neuroscientist who's studied brain behavior relationships, and as someone who is absolutely passionate about social justice, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this current situation. And, I think about the root of human behavior and how scapegoating is such a deeply rooted human form of diversion. The scapegoat carries the ills of the community and the sins of the people out from the community. And, COVID, like war, like natural disasters, leaves us feeling fearful, without control. We think about, the Black Plague and the anti-Semitic persecution that followed. But as someone who's passionate about science, it is frustrating now with all that is available that our community shuns facts sometimes and reverts to the scapegoating and the conspiracy theories that tend to blame a marginalized group, and that sort of assigns order and reason. What is we can't ignore, and Dr. McGonigal referenced this, is that these conspiracy theories and the wink and nod that enables the harassment that we've seen is reinforced by political expediency of our leadership. And despite scientific evidence to the contrary, there's a narrative and sometimes coded language that blames Asians and Asian Americans for COVID, rather than looking at internally as how we can approach it. Things like the novel coronavirus was made in a laboratory in China. We know that has no factual basis. That it was leaked from a laboratory, we know that and has no factual basis. That China hid information from the US and we didn't understand the extent of the virus, that is not accurate either. And we have leaders in this country calling the virus the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, and inserting they versus us. And these are the kinds of things that help keep this behavior going. You know, we also, as was mentioned, we are not seeing, while we see Asian Americans in particular targeted, Zoom bombing and other things we've seen with the coronavirus have brought out other forms of racism and bias and harassment. So sometimes it is about, blaming your favorite marginalized population, and it is very sad. Early on in this crisis, we had put together a statement of awareness and intolerance around what we saw was happening and what some of our own trainees and faculty who were on the front line of treating COVID were experiencing in the community and in the supermarket. Some of my colleagues, when they read it, said, oh, I didn't know this was such a thing. And I think it's really incumbent on us to have awareness. The awareness is the first step before we can step in and take action. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Others were quite disturbed and had not realized it. But again, we think we've gone beyond a lot of these behaviors. But in particular, over the last few years, there's a lot of signals to pull them out further. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton.
Hello and good afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and participate as a member of this particular panel. As mentioned, my name is Maurice Middleton. I am the Senior Director and also the Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action Compliance Officer out of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and head of the Department of Equity and Inclusion. This particular topic has been one, when we're talking about since this pandemic, that has really created within our office an uptick in complaints. And so in the Office of Equity and Inclusion, we are responsible for investigating any and all allegations of harassment and discrimination throughout our entire Emory enterprise. And I remember the very first complaint that we received. It actually came from a graduate professional student who contacted our office about an incident that took place during a group chat in which one of his peers were actually referring to the virus as the Kung flu. And so when we hear things like that and we witness these sorts of issues that come about, we feel as though, one, as a community, we have a responsibility to address them. But when I look at from our perspective as the office who's responsible for investigating these allegations, we have very strict guidelines and processes in how we go about reviewing and adjudicating these issues. And sometimes because of those strict guidelines, for instance, when you hear a comment like, oh, it's the Kung flu, Some people refer to that as, oh, that's harassing behavior and or discriminatory behavior. But when we look at it from a legal perspective, it's not necessarily considered harassment, but just because something isn't unlawful or illegal, it doesn't mean that it's okay. And so with situations like that, what we then tend to do is we work with our other offices who address areas around behaviors and conduct, things of that nature. And so as an office, when these issues arise, one of the things that we do is we try to, one, for our community, we want to inform them that it is possible that we address these issues as a community through bystander intervention. And I know Dr. Henderson is going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on in the presentation, but I think that's one of our most powerful components of addressing this particular issue when it's taking place in our community. I truly believe that in the power when we say things like what you permit, you promote. And so when we allow these certain things to take place in our community, we witness them, we don't intervene. The message that we're sending is that it's okay for us to engage in this way. It's okay for you to treat each other in this sort of manner. And I do recognize that when we're referring to things like bystander intervention, that this isn't an easy task. And it really depends on what do we consider as the value of our community. And so I just kind of quickly want to outline just some 5 quick steps when we're talking about bystander intervention, because I think it's really crucial that we understand what that process might look like. And so first, as a bystander, the first thing I need to do is I need to notice what's happening around me, right? And so you want to evaluate that particular situation. Is this something that I should get involved with? That's the next step, to consider whether or not this particular situation calls for some form of action. And so I want people to understand that when we're referring to action, there are many different ways to intervene. And I believe Dr. Collins mentioned this earlier in her presentation. There are ways to intervene that you may not have to directly interact and or directly get involved. That's even simply by picking up a cell phone and calling someone who you know can come in and step right in at that particular point to intervene. Calling the appropriate resources that's available to you as well as it pertains to intervening. The next thing is identifying, am I the responsible person for addressing this particular issue? And so I would say in situations like that, then when we're asking ourselves, am I the responsible person to address it? Then it really depends on you as an individual. Do you believe in the values of the organization in which you work? Do you believe in the commitment to the community? And for most of us, the answer to that is yes. So we would all be considered a responsible person to intervene. The next step in that particular process is to choose the action in which we think is best for that particular intervention. It could be through distraction. It could be through, as I mentioned before, a phone call. And then the last part in this is probably one of the most crucial, is do it in a way that's safe, right? It's safe for you, it's safe for the individuals involved. And I think we have to also remember when we're talking about bystander intervention and intervening in situations, remember when we intervene, it's to help the situation and not to escalate the situation. I think sometimes when we engage in the opportunity to intervene in certain situations, we may not realize that we may actually be escalating the matter and not, as I mentioned before, de-escalating it. So, you know, our responsibility in that process is just simply to be there to help and not to escalate that particular matter. And so I hope these tips are helpful for you in situations where you might find yourself where you're witnessing an event and you're not sure as to what you should do, that those particular steps are some that you can take in addressing those concerns. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. I'm not sure if I'm assuming I'm on, so thanks to everyone, my great colleagues here who have helped contribute to this wonderful conversation about ways to assist those who are being harmed. And so I want to point out two or three. First of all, I should say who I am. I'm Dr. Carol Henderson. I'm Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer, and Advisor to the President at Emory University. I'm also Professor Emerita in English and Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, where I spent 24 years in higher education before landing in this wonderful place called Emory University about a year ago. So I came in with Greg McGonigal and with Dean Inku Galai. So we're kind of a cohort that came in together, and they've been fabulous to work with. As well as Maurice Middleton and everyone here, of course, on the panel. I thank you. When I called you, you all said yes. And so Emory is very fortunate to have each of you here as part of a community that's invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion through policy, practice, and action. And so I appreciate you for that. And I want to look at this from a global perspective. Being in Africana Studies, hearing about the violence, and we'll talk about language a little later, because I know this has been named anti-Asian bias and harassment, but some of the things that people have been experiencing is really violent, and it's assault, and we need to name it, as Dr. Collins says, call it what it is. And so three things kind of stand out to me. One is the kinship between of communities of color in injustice. When I think of what's going on with African Americans, who are the highest individuals who are being impacted, Black and Brown communities, by COVID-19, I think the last numbers I saw was 83% of those who are in hospital in Georgia, Atlanta in particular, are from the African American community. When I think of the fact that there were African American men who were ushered out of stores because they were wearing masks, adhering to safety protocol, hatred, unfortunately, bias, when it's that violence does not take a vacation, and if anything escalates at this time. And so I want to acknowledge that, to also acknowledge that when I think of our world and world history, what happened after World War or during World War II, when Japanese were their property was taken away and they were herded into these horrible camps. When I think of 9/11 and what happened to the Muslim population and people of Muslim descent who were targeted and beaten, pulled out and how out of their cars and targeted in their homes. And then when I think of African American individuals who, when they came from war, were brutally murdered in their uniforms because people could not handle the fact that individuals who would lay down their life for a country they believe in were not respected in those ways. Interwoven into the ways in which we engaged is this sense of entitlement. I was having a conversation earlier today, and my hashtag was the entitlements of some is the death of others. And so there are some individuals who assume it is their right to attack others, to protect what they think is their country, because they don't understand that our founding documents are living documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. It said men at that time, but because it's a living document, we can say all people, and all people are included in that. And so it is our accountability measure in being part of this great society is that we have to hold each other accountable to that excellent standard. It is not okay to harm people. It is not okay to target people. And we should, and we do have provisions put in place in our country to address that. And so building on something that Mr. Middleton said earlier, and Wanda and Greg and Carolyn about bystander intervention, when I think of bystander intervention, the civil rights movement was an intervention mechanism. People sat by, they saw injustice, they acted. And so I think this is a moment for action. This is a moment to say it is not okay. And that action can occur in activism. It can occur through your connection to organizations like the Anti-Defamation Defamation League or the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. It can occur by educating other folks who may not even have the scope of who actually belongs in the Asian American community. I was thinking there are over 24 million people who identify as Asian or Pacific Islander in the US based on census data. And they're from backgrounds from East, Southeast, and South Asia. Countries that are included in that include China, India, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, just to name a few. And so one of the things I would ask is that people get educated about other people outside of their immediate space, and to not practice what I would call do not fall into apathy and the bystander effect, assuming somebody else is going to do it. What is your participation in this? The other thing I would say before I ask questions is bystander intervention is also voting. I'm going to put a plug in for that right now because we see what we get what we vote for, and I'll leave it at that, or we get what we don't vote for. And so if we want change, the change has to begin with us, and it has to start at the district, at the local, state, federal, and national levels. If we want to see change in policy, if we want to see laws that put people in jail for hate crimes, I understand there is no hate crime legislation. Even when we had lynchings on our country, they don't exist. And I find that troubling that in 2020, we're still having a debate about what hate crimes means. And if we want that change, then we need to exercise the one thing we do have. Because one of the things that we're seeing is that there are some things we can control, other things we can't, but we can control our vote. We can control our activism. We can control community building and how, as citizens of this country, we assist each other in building that community. So one of the questions I want to pose to the panel we have about 10 minutes before we open up for questions before Lane, but I have a few questions to help our conversation. So one would be, and anyone can answer this, what trends do you anticipate socially, economically, culturally, and any other space you think? It could be in the medical field as well, as we go through these phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. What's of concern to me is that violence is going to escalate if we don't address it now. And it'll be the Asian American community today, it'll be the African American community tomorrow, it'll be the Latinx community the day after that, and any other vulnerable population that does not fit into people's definition of who belongs. So xenophobia, nativism, all of those things. If you're not native from here, we see that fact that dreamers were called out and were not supported in the stimulus funding that came through the CARES Act, and we did not act in a careful way with that. So what trends do you see? Carolyn?
Boy, there's sure going to be many. Obviously, the state of social distancing will continue. We all have a way to connect through Zoom to continue to support our community. Not everybody has the same connectedness. So certainly the digital divide, I think, will exacerbate our differences in our community. I think about the social covenant of what we try to teach to the community as healthcare workers. My mask protects you, your mask protects me. I think that's a message that needs to be amplified because like you, Carol, I think that as we spend more time being frustrated and not feeling control, these acts of violence and harassment and marginalization, immigrants is another population that's being impacted, that's going to all get worse. So I think we have to really amplify the message. And politics is how you advocate for the values that you support within your community. So I wanted to echo that.
Yes. Greg, you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I might add, you know, trends around religious diversity and religious interconnection to the list. I mean, I would like to hope that this is a moment, just drawing on that theme of social covenant and social contract, where we could see communities coming together. You know, I've been really pleased that at Emory, the kind of the watchword for this response to the pandemic has been Emory together, and really thinking of a unifying way to think of us as a community that across differences of race, religion, class, you know, age, any other status that people might have, that we are really in this together in a deep way. If we thought that our identities somehow kept people separate or, you know, made us immune to this, this is a great, in some ways, could be a great, you know, point of understanding how interconnected we truly are, and then hopefully working to sort of level that playing field in ways that that it really needs to be. I mean, one of the concerns to me is around healthcare access right now, and thinking about the ways that the virus is disproportionately impacting different communities. People do not have the same access to healthcare clearly, and that's feeding into that, as well as the, you know, disparities in access to communications and the resources to have that, even time, you know, based on those that people may be caring for at home or the nature of people's jobs. So I hope and I pray and I think that I hope that churches, congregations, spiritual communities can help to lift up the interconnected bonds that we have across identities, and really think about, wow, you know, if we were under the illusion that someone else's healthcare, you know, didn't impact mine in some way, or mine didn't impact someone else's. I mean, you know, this is a very clear and stark example of the ways that we are all interconnected, and so I hope an opportunity for us to and for people to really realize how deeply interconnected we are.
Yes, a great point about that interconnection is, I'm going to give Wanda and Maurice time to speak as well, but just to lift those things up about community, which I think is fabulous, and our interconnectedness. The entire globe got a pause button at this moment, and those frail or fragile systems, systemic issues are being exacerbated in ways that are giving us an opportunity to say, how do we push reset, and how do we realize and you know, how do we give food for children who relied on food at school for education? Or Maurice and I spoke earlier about an image that's going around that home education is not equal for everyone. There was this child who's standing on boxes and ragged clothes looking through a window with someone who has a laptop, and they don't have a laptop, and they're trying to learn, and it breaks your heart to see that image, but there are real things like that going on. And so I hope it gives us a time to reflect and realize that we are accountable to each other. Wanda, Maurice? You all want to
yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, when I think about trends, I think about the way that people respond when they're under intense stress and uncertainty, which is certainly overwhelming for a lot of people. And when that happens psychologically, people tend to get very black and white in their thinking, right? So you're either in my group or you're out of my group, right? Things are good or bad. And when we start to label things in that way and get into sort of that rigid framework of thinking, we're not able to think about problems and issues in a complex way, in an empathic way, in a creative way. And so I think it's really important that we continue to stay engaged in educating, in really underscoring how we are all interconnected, and doing things that we can in our sphere of influence, whatever that is, to have a sense of control and to take positive action, positive change. And I also think with the election coming up and these things sort of compounding on each other, that the fall is going to be a difficult time, which is why it is so important to stay in community and to do the things that we can to make a positive difference.
Agreed. And yes, community connection. And when I think of trans wellness, I think that's the other thing you're pointing to, because if you were taking better care of yourself, you might not direct that anger and energy at someone else who is not connected to what that issue is. And my comment has always been the kind of hatred I'm seeing has always been there. This moment just unleashed it in ways that are troubling and inappropriate and uncalled for. Maurice?
Yeah, so I think for me, the biggest concern around what I can foresee being a trend and or trending is that, when we're having these particular issues, right now, the targeted community are individuals who are Asian and or Pacific Islander. However, the more statistics that come out about the actual people who are infected, we see that, a high percentage of individuals being infected by this particular disease are African Americans. And so I can see the crossover that's going to take place in regards to now that particular group will then be targeted. And then it will be, as you mentioned earlier, our Latinx community who will then be targeted. And so, but what I can also see that that I am encouraged by is I can also see that as a community that we will band together in addressing all of these issues that we're now starting to see that's coming across our tables on a regular basis.
Yes, indeed. And that we will hold each other again accountable, and that it will not be okay to direct any animus and violence towards a particular group or individual, that the humanity of our society, because I do believe it's there. I don't want us to end this discussion on that note that there is no way out, because I think history has demonstrated that we as a people rise to the occasion and become our better selves. That's the hope I have. And that now social media and discussion and activism and our youth, our students are what is not acceptable. We act on that. And I think they will show us the way if we move and give them room to do that. And so I'm looking forward to standing with them and assisting them when asked. I didn't say leading them, which we tend to do, but assisting them because they're very intelligent. We raise them that way, and that they will invite us into this movement and moment, so that they can create the society they want to live in and thrive in as they move through the seasons of their lives. So right now, I'm going to, because we had two great questions, but we'll have to save those because it's 1:45. We've had some fabulous discussion. And to have Lane, if there are questions from the audience, and I want to just right now take the time, in case I don't remember, to thank those who have tuned in for participating today. And we'll have some words of encouragement when we end in a bit, but we want to take your questions right now.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Henderson, and all our panelists. Our first question is, how do you anticipate that the president's recent executive order banning almost all legal immigration will influence this conversation about racism and xenophobia coming to light in the midst of COVID?
So, and that's to anyone on the panel?
Yes, any or all.
Again, the ban on immigration started well before COVID-19. I think people's, if we remember, and my colleagues can assist me in this, I think this started a while ago where certain groups were targeted as not being allowed to come into the country. And so what I'm hoping is we're going to have to, as a society, so we put people in office, but the power really resides in the people who live in communities who say, we're not going to tolerate this. We, granted, our leaders are in positions of power to do that, but all leaders do not think that way. And so I think supporting the ones that are actually about community is the best way to address that. And so I don't see those mechanisms staying in place forever and for long. And what I really want to do is support those who are from immigrant communities here. I think it's very important because if the truth be told, all of us are immigrants. We know what group was here before any of us landed here. And so I think it's important for us to remember the language we use as well. There's one term I cannot, terms like illegal alien, no one's an alien. Immigrant, what does that mean? How do we play with that and use that in our everyday communication? Language is powerful. It can be a joiner, or it can be one where it separates us. So I think the more we cultivate the fact that all of us as human beings have the opportunity and the right to be treated as that, if we start from that common denominator and then assist those who may have different ways of engaging in our community, strengthening our support for those, I think that's the best way we can address that as our other leaders recalibrate. I'll use that word, recalibrate. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Just one thought, I mean, if anything, I think this pandemic has shown us that we really are part of a global community. There's no us at home, right? There's us.
Yes.
Regardless of where you live on the planet. And so I think as the weeks and months unfold, that will just become increasingly apparent. There's no other, right, where danger exists. We're a global community.
Yeah, and we'll have to find other ways to travel as well, because one of the things is I want us to make sure our borders do not become walls, but bridges. That's the one thing out of this, that I do not want our borders to become walls, but I want them to become bridges of access so we can continue to thrive as a global community. Any other questions, Lane?
Yeah, the next one is, how do we find the courage to have these conversations with people that have different definitions of equity? And how can we lead this or help lead these conversations with our students?
Anyone want to address that?
Gregory, go ahead. Were you going to say?
Yeah, so Greg, I know it was Greg and Wanda. Yeah.
I think because of our work, we're often coming into contact with people who have strongly held beliefs, right, on many different issues, and people, especially people's religious and philosophical beliefs are, usually very deep-seated, and people will sometimes have a sense that their beliefs are, not only right for them but right for everyone, and want to bring others over to their ideas. One thing that I've found helpful in this myself is actually to ask people about their story. How did you come to believe what you do? Because often I feel like, quote unquote dialogue or debate is the debate between two different conclusions. It's not a debate between the stories by which people got to what they believe. And I find it actually just much more interesting to find out how someone came to believe what they do, how someone's, deep-seated faith or their convictions or their, certain political belief or outlook on the world, how it came to be. And usually I find there's a lot more room for common ground in that story once you start to get into the story, but that the conclusion can often be a kind of an obstacle, and that it can look very different at the conclusion, but when you dig deeper, often there's a story there, and it's often really revelatory of the humanity of everyone involved, and then there are points of connection. That's just one thought.
Love that. Love that. Wanda?
Amen, Greg. I guess one thing that I like to think about is that we're all on a journey around our racial identity development and what we know, and so much about learning to have compassion and empathy for people who are different from us. It has to do with education and with contact. So we all have opportunities to educate people about our histories if we can do it with humility rather than condescension. And I think when people are educated, when they start to understand the history in a different way, certainly in a different way than it's been taught in the American school systems, and we can also have compassion for where people are on their journey, even if it's not where we wish that they would be, that can really go a long way. And the other thing is contact. So for people who've grown up in very homogenous environments and they've just not had contact with people who are different from them, it's certainly harder to see. It can certainly be harder to see the humanity in people who are different, who we don't have interaction with. And so I think that we have to sort of hold on to both of those and have faith that people can sort of move along the process, move along their journey if we can be compassionate with them and be educating them from a space of humility.
Love that. Love that. I don't know if Maurice or Carolyn want to ask that, but I love that. Setting ground rules for those courageous and sometimes difficult conversations. I would say it's not about conversion, it's about understanding. And oftentimes when people come into these conversations about equity, they think you're going to convert them or disavow who they are as a human being. So I really appreciate what Greg and Wanda have had to say. Maurice, Carolyn?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's okay for us to have different views, right? And as Wanda mentioned just a moment ago, we are all on our own journeys, and we are in different places in our journeys. What's not okay is when we begin to judge people on their view or where they are in their journeys. And so I think when we all recognize that we are all in different steps or different phases of where we are in our journey, I think then we're more, I'm not a big fan of this word, tolerable of one another in situations like that. But I think, for me, it's again, just simply respecting where people are in their journeys. And it's okay for us to have that dialogue and communicate with those individuals. And it's not to convert them over to our side of thinking, but it's to help them understand why we think the way that we think and why we believe the way that we believe.
Indeed. Carolyn?
Yeah, I love what's been said already. It's about that humble inquiry, to understand where others are from, because just the moment we look at each other, we make assumptions and sort of peeling the onion and, oh, I didn't realize you had this and we had this in common. So that can often be very helpful. And I think we do live in a society where we focus on the sides and then the people are bad who are on that side.
Yes, and I love you using the analogy peeling the onion, because I think in some of these conversations we will cry. When I think about how I have to cook with onion, there may be uncomfortable conversations that are very piercing. There may be some things we find out about ourselves that we didn't know and we didn't think. My normal may not be your normal, or my middle may not be your middle, and I've done all right with my life, and so have you. So then, what do we do with that information? So I think that you all offer some wonderful, wonderful reflections on that. I think we can take one more question, Lane, and then I'm gonna have everyone. Well, I want everyone to give words of encouragement. We have 4 minutes. I understand we have an hour, and so what I've offered to Lane is if anyone else wants to ask questions, please feel free to send those and give those to Lane, and then she will give those to us. And if we have time, we will respond to those so that our responses can be posted with the video in our question and answer section, if that's okay. So as we leave, I had already prepped the panel leave words of encouragement. And so I'll begin by saying, again, thinking of Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I think the whole quote says something that we are tied together. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. So I want those of Asian, that belong to the Asian heritage community, those of Asian American, Asian descent, Pacific Islander, that we stand with you, and that we consider you brothers and sisters in our human fabric community, and that we have not experienced your pain, but we know and we empathize with that, and this is a call to action. I'll start with Wanda.
I guess what I would just want to leave as a final thought is, for a lot of Asians and Asian Americans, we're very private. We don't like to make waves. We like to just sort of, put our heads down and do the work and move forward. So I would just encourage you that if you're struggling, or if you've been needing support, to reach out and ask for it. That it's okay to do that, and talk with friends, talk with family, certainly talk with a therapist if that would be helpful, because it's confidential. Talk with a faith leader. That there's nothing to be ashamed of about being oppressed. That it shouldn't happen, and you have a right to your feelings about it, and certainly deserving of the support to work through it.
Wonderful. Greg?
Absolutely, and I so appreciate so much of what's been said. I think it's been a really such a rich conversation. I think I would add that certainly for those who have experienced any kind of violence, bias, or aggression, to seek out the support that they need. I think for those of us who haven't, who aren't in a targeted community, this is really an opportunity to learn maybe what we don't know, and to dig more deeply into some of the activism, some of the organizations. So those who are feeling that, I'm curious about this issue, but this isn't something that's touched my own life directly right now, there's a lot that can be done in this time. So even though some of our ways of coming together may not be the same, it is an opportunity. And just thinking back to some of the things that Buddha taught on this Buddha Day, our perception of the moment can really shape what's possible in the moment. So for those who can, seeing this as an opportunity for learning and deepening and making change, even if it looks different from how it usually does.
Wonderful. Carolyn, and then Maurice.
I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the power of small acts, and amplifying on Maurice's message about bystander training and bystander action. The bystander effect is a natural passive effect, and to be an upstander does not necessarily require heroism, but the most important part of it is reinforcing with the person who has been targeted that they shouldn't feel devalued, that this was not right what happened to them, and reaching out. So I think there's much that we can do with small acts, and just the community's appreciation for healthcare workers has been a lot of its small acts, and incredibly powerful and meaningful.
Indeed. It makes me weepy every time I see a commercial or hear the people banging on pots and pans, or seeing the signs. Indeed, that's the best, that's our best selves, and that's what I hang my hat on. Maurice?
Yeah, so for me, I'm a true believer in the notion that we teach people how to treat us with our everyday interactions with them, right? And what I would encourage people to do is to have the courage to speak up, have the courage to stand up. And it goes back to a saying that I said a little bit earlier: what you permit, you promote. And so to be comfortable with, again, addressing certain issues and responding to certain things that take place that harm us, that are violent, that creates a negative impact on us. And so I think for me, those would be the two things that stick out. Remember, again, to be encouraged, to have courage, and speak up when you recognize that there are wrongs being done.
Fabulous. This has been wonderful. I thank each of you, Dr. Wanda Collins, Mr. Maurice Middleton, Dr. Carolyn Meltzer, and the fabulous chaplain and dean of spiritual and religious life, Greg McGonigal. I'll turn it back over to Lane. I am Dr. Carol Henderson, the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion here at Emory. And I thank you for tuning in with us today. Lane?
Thank you so very much. I want to echo my sincere thanks to all of our panelists. You all brought amazing expertise to this important conversation, and thank you all for attending. This has been recorded. We're going to be sending the recording out tomorrow, as well as some follow-up answers to the many questions that were submitted. I also want to remind you this is part of a series, so please do stay tuned for these upcoming discussions that we're going to have throughout the month of May on this important topic and celebrating this heritage and culture. With that, I'm going to bid everyone a happy Thursday. Take care, keep washing your hands, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.